It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, good evening and welcome to another edition of Islands at War. Another special edition. I have with me Tim Osborne, who Tim was with us recently. So it's me, Keith Bengelli, in conversation about books, recommended books to do with the Channel Islands occupation. And that will be Guernsey and Alderney. No Nick today. So myself in conversation with Tim. Tim, welcome.
Hello, Keith. Nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming in. So this will be the first of at least two, possibly three programs that we're going to do to recommend books about the occupation here in the Channel Islands. We think that in the run-up to Christmas, they may serve as being the ideal presents for people that are interested in that period. And if you weren't interested in that period, you wouldn't be listening to our podcast. So off we go. Tim, so your first nomination, as it were, is a book by a gentleman called Ernie Gavay, and you've got two editions here. One is an updated edition, I believe, and they are to do with the fortifications based on, certainly Guernsey. Do they extend to other islands in the bailiwick?
Well, there is a similar guide, I know, in Alderney. I'm not too sure about Jersey, but the first edition started me off, basically, in interest in fortifications in Guernsey, hence the title. There are two versions. The first one was 1997, and the newer one is 2023. Came out last year. There were some errors in the first one. However, it's a bit small. It fits in the pocket a bit better,
yep.
and it certainly started me off because you can follow the maps that Ernie has drawn. And you can find the bunkers and the various weapons pits and Tobruk pits yourself as you walk around and just choose a particular path you want to take. It's all broken up into sections. You know, for example, Le Corbière to Saints Bay or whatever it might be.
Yes,
it's all in there. The newer one from a year or so ago is updated. It's got some great photographs in. Again, the maps have been enhanced and there's a few more things that have corrected what there were, or the errors from the first one. Not many, but there's a few errors. And they've also added a couple more positions in that weren't on the first one. Personally, the first one, the first edition, the smaller book, is easy to put in your pocket and to walk around with. But the second one is probably better as a guide for me, and a reference, a point of reference, basically,
yes.
To look at the photographs. There's some great photos in there. So yeah, certainly that's a recommendation for anyone that would be starting out with an interest in occupation stuff, bunkers, fortifications, gun pits, all that kind of thing. That's all in there. So that would be probably the first book I would buy.
Yes, and I've used it extensively. And for the listener, it's important to perhaps know that I'm a qualified tour guide, and certainly so is Tim. And I find it's invaluable for tracing the route of walks that I'm putting together. And of course, it does give you the maps. It gives you some great photographs, but it also explains as well that the fortifications on Guernsey, especially, when they evolved, didn't they? I mean, the first fortifications really were within some of the Napoleonic and pre-Napoleonic areas, fortifications that we have. And I'm thinking of Fort Grey, Fort Pézerey, for those people that don't know the island. These are fortifications that were already put in place 200 years ago. The Germans placed weaponry and such within the perimeters of these, and Ernie certainly explains so much about those, and also the more informal ones, because before the Atlantic Wall was built, and preceding that, before Hitler started to put the fortifications in place ahead of the Atlantic Wall in March, April, May 41, a lot of the peripheral fortifications were pretty informal, weren't they? They were sort of trenches with sandbags and mortar pits, and there's not much trace of these now at all, and some, in fact, may actually be on private property.
Yeah. There are traces, but they're not easy to see or to find. One that just springs to mind is actually at Luray, there is a gun, a coastal defence gun in one of the casemates there, but it not far away from it is an anti-aircraft position, rudimentary concrete construction. I mean, you look at it, it's not reinforced concrete, and that was done by an army construction battalion in 41 at some point, or maybe even before. And you can see there's a definite difference between positions like that and post October 41 concrete positions.
Yes, I mean, the area that I know very, very well is the Saints Bay area on the southwest part of Guernsey, for those of you who know the island. And that was heavily fortified in terms of, there was a lot of military attention there, because this is where the commandos, or so-called commandos, came ashore, the spies, Hubert Nicol, Desmond Mulholland, Philip Martel, etc. Mm-hmm. And because there was a lot of activity in that area, the Germans initially put a lot of their fortifications in. And so it wasn't just a case of pouring concrete, digging pits and that. There was a lot of ignition mines and mortars, minefields, etc. And didn't they find an ignition bomb recently?
I think they did, actually. There is something that in the back of my mind, it just remembers that they have. That's right, they did. But certainly the approaches to some of the bays earlier on in the occupation, they did mine. For example, Fermain was another one. I think it was one of the first ever minefields they put down there, the pass up there. So they obviously selected some of these bays on the east or the south coast that they thought would be easily accessible to, well, post those commando type raids, incursions. That's how it started off with the mines, and then obviously they progressed after that. But I think they did. I think you're right.
Yeah, there was. There's a lot of pictures in circulation, and from the period you could see Saints Bay had underwater. Well, when the tide was up, underwater, what do you call them? Not exactly fortifications, but obstacles. And the other thing, of course, is that the Napoleonic loop towers, or pre-Napoleonic loop towers, similar to the one above Saints Bay, which my brother renovated, they mounted machine guns, didn't they? Anti-aircraft guns.
They did. They were observation places, if you like, with a machine gun on top. I do remember reading something whereby one of the ones at Langcrest, that a Spitfire, I believe, but it was an Allied British fighter, swooped low over one of those there, and the German machine gunner had to cower down as it came low over the top. That was actually seen by some civilians walking around there, and they documented it. I can't remember where I read it, but yeah. So there was a machine gunner on top of that one.
Yes, and so both of these books by Ernie, first edition, let's call it the second edition, they cover the whole period of the occupation, don't they? They take you right from the very, very first positions right through to the very last fortifications that were built. When did because obviously these were constructed by somebody, so some of these buildings would have been, some of these fortifications would have followed a pattern that one might see along the French coast, for example, with various changes. Predominantly, who actually built these? What's the differentiation between German engineers, organisation Todd, and slave workers, for example? What's the sort of timeline? When did the very first ones, would they have been German sappers, for example, German engineers?
Yeah, so the first ones in the army construction battalions, we're going back into late 40s, early 41, would have been German soldiers, if you like, or at least part of the construction battalions. So engineers to a degree, I guess, and they just built these more rudimentary constructions that wouldn't have lasted very long had they been attacked or bombed. But then, of course, after Hitler had ordered the fortifications of the islands, that's when the Labour came over. That's when Organisation Todt brought their Labour. They had a pool of about 500,000 at some point.
Could you just describe a little bit of background of the Organisation Todt, or the OT, as distinct from what we would know as slave workers? Because there was quite a hierarchy, and people in Organisation Todt were actually paid by the German military?
Yes. Well, certainly some of them were paid. It started in the 1930s, and they wanted Labour to build big construction projects in Germany, such as the autobahns and stuff. So they had it was a Labour that was brokered out to the construction companies, and then that grew Dr. Fritz Topp was in charge. He didn't see the war out.
He died in an air crash, didn't he?
Yeah. Apparently there are conspiracy theories of how he died.
Yeah, there always is.
with everything. So, he built it up, and eventually it was taken over by Albert Speers, And, so it started with Germans working for them, then expanded to other nationalities from the the countries that they overran, if you like. And then when they went eastwards into Russia, when Hitler made that mistake, if you like, not at the time of going to Russia, they had a vast pool of workers out there. Ostarbeiter, I'm sure you've heard the word, which is Russian, Polish and Ukrainian. They lumped it together, basically Eastern European workers. And they supplied, they counted as quite a high percentage of the whole labour force later on, certainly after kind of 42 into 43. And so the Channel Islands had their share of workers, some were paid, conscripted workers that were paid, were treated on a scale not too badly. And then you went down to kind of forced workers, which sometimes get mixed up with slave workers. But essentially you got to a point where they weren't paid and they weren't treated very nicely. In Guernsey, it wasn't as bad as Alderney, but that's another kettle of fish, as you know. So you had these different grades, and there were certainly in Guernsey there were worker camps, and they were 8-10 hours plus a day, depending. When you had a big bunker, when you had a large complex that needed lots of concrete, they would work until it was finished. They'd work in shifts, and pour 24 hours a day until it was for the integrity of the.
Yes, my grandmother got into trouble more than once for throwing food scraps to slave workers. And now the slave workers didn't see the war out here, did they? They were taken back to France, I think, to work on V2 launch sites, I believe, because until recently I was fortunate to be an attendant at the Kriegsmarine bunker just outside St. Peter Port. This would have been the German Naval Communication headquarters. Now that construction work started there in September 1943, and it was opened 1st of February 1944. It's a big complex, and I believe it took 48 hours to non-stop on the searchlights, to pour the concrete. And this is the time of the blackout, though the Allies obviously were watching and listening to all of this anyway. But this particular structure wasn't built by slave labour. They'd already gone back to France. That you're very aware of that rather large bunker, a sophisticated bunker. Was that the last major structure built on Guernsey? Of
size-wise, yes, it was definitely one of the last, if not the last.
Yeah.
They were still building after that, but smaller things. I've found to Brookpit with a date of 1944 in it.
Oh, okay.
So
post D-Day, that sort of.
No, pre D-Day.
Yeah. And post D-Day was there any sort of change or upgrading to the fortifications?
They tailed off by about that time. When it came to D-Day and what was happening, everything, there was a lot of changes at that time, and certainly a lot of the labour had started going back then. In actual fact, the German railway, which we might talk about a bit later on, that was put down to take, the building materials around, they'd already started taking that up. In fact, it was almost all up by then. It was only the east coast that was still laid down at that time. So,
well, we'll get onto the railway
in
due course. So just to round up about Ernie Gaffey's books, certainly the second edition is available. And of course, when we say available, we're very conscious we've got listeners all around the world, and one can only hope that Amazon, etc., can supply these books. But that one is currently available.
Yes, the 2023 second edition is available. You can still get the first edition. Amazon seems to be one of the first choices, or eBay. Yeah, Amazon or eBay. If it was me, that's what I'd be Googling up. Yeah. You can get it, but the price of it's gone up quite a bit, obviously, because it's been out of print for a little bit.
Yes, and it has value, not only if you live on the island like Tim and I do, if you're familiar with the island or just interested in German fortifications, those are go-to books on Tim's recommendations. So that's your first one, Tim. Mm-hmm. That's great. Next, we go to a book by the author Eric Lee, Operation Basalt. Give us the sort of reasons why you've chosen this book, and I know it's been extremely useful for you for your tours. If you could talk us through that.
Well, some people may know, but some people may not know that Operation Basalt was a commando raid, a British commando raid, during the early part of October 1942. We could talk a lot about the raid, but essentially they came over to do some reconnaissance and also to take away German prisoners for interrogation. And it went wrong insofar as it ended up with a fight, if you like, between German pioneer soldiers and 10 commandos, because 2 had actually stayed back by then. And 3 Germans died as a result. They are buried in Guernsey at the Fort George Cemetery. And they took 1 German prisoner back, and he was interrogated, but they didn't actually get a lot of information that was particularly useful, just even more of interest, really, what was going on, about where the mines were and the fact that there was a boom across the harbour. But there was huge implications because both Churchill and Hitler got involved.
There's a lot of controversy around this raid, isn't there?
A lot of controversy, even to this day.
Yes.
The person in charge of Operation Basalt, Geoffrey Appleyard, he had to go to see Churchill literally the day after he got back, because they all got back safely, the British side, with 1 German prisoner. And Churchill wanted to know all about what had happened. And then Hitler got involved because the Germans that were found, 2 of them, had their hands essentially tied behind their back. The commandos had used the rope to hold them together and to basically to stop them from running away. That was why they did it. They didn't do it for another reason. But of course, they had 2 German soldiers with ropes around their hands tied at the back, and basically they just said that they shot unarmed people and they tied them up first. So he brought out his commando order, which essentially gave carte blanche to Germans that captured special forces operations or commandos, and they were to be shot without question. And or you could interrogate them, then shoot them afterwards. So, and a lot of soldiers died because of that, including 2 officers on that raid. So 2 officers on Operation Basalt were actually executed through his orders as a result of the raid they were on.
Yes, and much later in the war. What's the timeline for Basalt? What period of the war?
Yeah, so it was on the night of the 3rd, 4th October 1942.
Yep.
And they arrived on a boat from England. They got onto a smaller boat, Goatley, off Sark, and they arrived about midnight, roughly about midnight. And they got back about 3:30 in the morning. But by then, when they were running back down the path, it was dark, of course. It's well into autumn, going not that far into winter. Appleyard knew Sark, luckily, because he'd spent a lot of time there as a youngster. And in fact, Appleyard's sister ended up marrying the tenant of Herm post-war.
All right.
So Major Wood, Jenny Wood.
Oh yes, yes, of course, yes.
Was Appleyard's sister. And they spent lots of family holidays there. So he knew the ground, and they ran back with their prisoner, getting there at 3:30. And luckily, the Lieutenant Freddie Bourne, who was in charge of the boat, had stayed beyond the 3 o'clock that they'd arranged because of what had happened on a previous raid where it all went wrong. And the officer in charge of the small-scale raiding force who carried it out, 62 Commander Group, he was killed. And so Appleyard had taken over. So Bourne couldn't help them out in his boat, and he was conscious of what happened. So he stayed extra time just in case. And luckily, they came later and they all got away, and the boat got away, and it wasn't chased, and they got back to England.
And it has to be said, of course, that this, when they arrived and when they left, you're talking about scaling a cliff at night.
Oh, yeah.
And doing the same, getting down with a German prisoner. So there was German fatalities, wasn't there?
Yes, there were 3. There was a sentry, and he was killed by, at the time, Second Lieutenant Anders Lassen, the crazy Dane, they called him.
Yeah, well, quite a famous or infamous combatant during the war, wasn't he?
He was. And he died just not long before the end of the hostilities in
Casino, wasn't it?
Casino on action, and he actually died a hero because he was basically leading a group to take out some lookout posts and machine gun posts, and they took the first 2 out. It was on the 3rd one when he ran forward that he was sprayed with machine gun bullets, and he took some hits, and he still lobbed a grenade before he died.
Yeah.
And he is a hero in Denmark.
Very much so, yeah.
And his grave has always got the flowers on, and he was posthumously awarded the VC.
Yeah. But in in Sark, the raid, he was the centre of controversy, I think, because of the death of the first German combatant. He took him out as a sentry.
That's Peter Oswald. He was the oldest of the three, but he was, I think, 36 years old. And as they made their way along from where they came up at the top of the cliffs to past their first house that they went to, the Petit Descartes, they then they ended up at a house called Le Gispallery, found a local lady. It was actually the late doctor's wife. This is now about 1 o'clock in the morning. And they woke her up, and they're talking to her for about half an hour. And she said that there were Germans in the hotel, which was the Descartes Hotel nearby. And they made their way from there. They said their goodbyes to her. This is a nutshell, a very brief précis of it. They went to the Descartes. They went in the Descartes into an annex, and they stood outside. There were 6 locked doors, and they stood outside each door ready just to go in on the command. And if there was a German in there or Germans, they would then take them out. And that's exactly what happened. But just before that happened, as they were making their approach, they could see and hear a sentry walking up and down. And they were all kind of crouching down on the ground. And Appleyard said to Lassen, "You go and sort him out. You take him out." And that's exactly what happened. Lassen crept forward. He was timing him. Each time he turned, he was timing him, ready to pounce at the correct moment. So when he came and then he turned away from him back the other way, Lassen pounced and plunged a knife into his back, and he died pretty quickly, and they dragged him under a bush, and then they went forward.
Yeah, yes. And then, of course, there were the 2 more fatalities. So this book covers the whole of the raid, obviously, the lead up to it. I've read it, obviously. It covers the sort of ramifications, the wider ramifications of Hitler's decree, which, as you said, led to this infamous sort of Führer order that special forces were to be interrogated and executed almost on capture. And this was quite widespread right through to the end of the war, wasn't it?
It was, yes. I mean, this is a great book if you're interested. There's been other books written, but Eric did a lot of research on this. And he takes you through from the start what the special, how the SSRF, the small scale raiding force, started. And essentially it was because Gus March Phillips, who was in charge until Operation Aquatint when he was killed, and I mentioned before, and Appleyard, they'd met on the beach in Dunkirk. And basically they were sharing the same dugout together to take shelter. And it started from there. And they ended up getting this place in 42, this Anderson Manor in Dorset, which is where they did a lot of their training, and they all came together. They weren't a large group. I think there was something like about somewhere in the region of 20 to 40 maximum of these people that were handpicked, and they were to be a nuisance to Germans in the Channel Islands and on the French coast. Churchill wanted these little groups to cause problems with the Germans and to direct soldiers from one area to another where they wouldn't actually be needed very much. So it was one of Churchill's things to get this going.
Yeah.
Of course, when the commandos first started, they weren't exactly very well organised in the 40s, in the early part of the war, when there was an operation in Guernsey, actually, Operation Ambassador, which was a failure essentially.
Yes, that's right. That was July 1940. Right. Okay. So Operation Basalt by Eric Lee.
Yep.
Another recommendation from Tim Osborne. You're listening to a special here of Islands at War. Myself, Keith Bengelli, in conversation with Tim Osborne. Tim, local historian and tour guide, recommending his favourite or his most informative books about the occupation, various aspects. Tim is a very well-known tour guide. And I think you're picking books that are invaluable to not only for your tours, but also for interest in the occupation at large. We're actually going to cross now to Alderney, and a book by Brian Bonnard. I'll just go back to Operation Basalt, and we should say that this is commonly available, isn't it? That's still in print.
You could get that.
Yeah,
you can get that in print.
Okay, we turn now to, as I say, a book about Alderney called Alderney at War, Brian Bonnard. I've not seen this before. This might be a bit more difficult to lay your hands on. But Tim, just explain to us the background of the book, why it gets your recommendation and why it means so much to you.
Okay, well, there's been a few books written on Alderney, as you were. We're not going to get into it now; it's another subject. But there's been various things with inquiries that have just been going through for over the last year. But I had this book some years ago. My work takes me to Alderney, or has taken me to Alderney a lot over about the last 17, 18 years. So I've spent a lot of time over there. I've actually got a car over there, so I can go off in my days off and wander around the different fortifications, which is what I do. And this book was brought to my attention by a historian in Alderney. It's called Alderney at War. It was first published in 1993. It's out of print, but you can get it again. Actually, there's a shop in Alderney, which I'll discuss with you later on, that sells it, and also it's on the internet. Written by Brian Barnard. He died last year, and he was in his 90s. And he has written various books on Alderney, but this particular one takes you from what happened just before the Germans came over to the islands until afterwards, when the islanders started coming back. And Alderney has always been different from Guernsey and Jersey. Primarily is because virtually everyone left. There was only about 7 people left on the island, I'm sure you're aware. Whereas Jersey and Guernsey had several thousand, many thousand, most of the population, well, quite a lot of the population. There was some evacuated, of course. So there was not many people to witness what was going on. But this takes you through. It deals with why they made their decision, the fact that the Guernsey government really wanted them to leave. It was sending boats to pick them up. And at one point, I think they forced people to leave their houses and get to Guernsey. And then some boats came from England, and they took quite a lot to England as well. In fact, most went to England, but there were some that went to Guernsey. Once the first English-bound boats went, still quite a few people remained in Alderney. And then at the time, the government brought some boats over, and they wanted to get them to Guernsey. In other words, they wanted them to the island. However, about 7 people stayed. So it takes you from about there, and it tells you when the Germans first arrived. It tells you about the workers from Guernsey and Jersey that went over to cultivate the land and use the crops and repair houses and things like this. And then it takes you through to the large labour force that was brought over to build the bunkers and the fortifications, again, post-October 41, after Hitler had decreed to fortify the islands. And then it goes into some detail about the different camps, the 4 main camps that were built for the labourers: Sylt, Helgoland, Norderney and Borkum. And there's quite a few photographs, even some I'd never seen before in here. So there's really interesting photographs as well as the text. And it just gives an overview. And he's actually spoken to people that were there at the time. And he's built the book up, and it's just a great read if you want to start learning about what happened in Alderney, and also what happened afterwards when they had to stay and clear up all the debris of war, and then you had the returning islanders that had to basically rebuild their lives again. The houses were in a right state. Yeah,
the houses had been wrecked by the German forces and organisation Todd personnel. There was 3 films made about the evacuation of Alderney. I think recently, I certainly remember going to see one at Candy Museum. Yes. Am I right thinking this was sort of like 3 episodes?
There are. It was Charlie Govan did it. I helped him on one of them with some information, but he actually got to speak to 1 or 2 people that were there that actually were forced onto Alderney to work. So it's great. I think you can buy they're in DVDs, that they were in DVDs that you could buy. I know at one point they sold them in Candy Museum, but that's going back a little while ago.
Yeah.
I think if you Google's great. I think you'll be able to find it. I think you can still buy it. They're still available to buy, but I'm not quite sure where. It's a 3-part series, you're right.
Yes. If listeners are interested in that, they want to send an email through to occupied@gnetradio.com. Nick and I will get onto that and see the availability, because they're extremely well. It's a documentary series, and it's very, very poignant, very emotional. There was one part in it where they talked about the boat that took the islanders away, leaving Bray Harbour in St Anne's in Alderney, obviously. Many of the abandoned animals came down onto the quayside and were sort of watching in bewilderment as their owners disappeared. They had many animals, pets, dogs and cats primarily, were euthanized by the vets there, but they just run out of time, and a lot of these animals were left to roam, and of course the cattle needed to be milked and such. So it's quite emotional. It's a part of the war, certainly part of the occupation, that is a little forgotten, because the occupation tends in many ways to focus on Jersey and Guernsey, and our islands at war is more towards the bailiwick, and of course Alderney is part of the bailiwick. But the leaving of Alderney and how the population faced up to the wrench of leaving their homeland is all human life is there, all human nature is there. So yeah, I mean, again, Brian Bonnard, Alderney at war, and I think at the end of the programme we might have some information on how people could maybe pick that one up. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, I'll give the name of a shop in Alderney, and the lady that runs a shop, that she actually has quite a nice stock of these old books. I have a rummage around myself when I'm there. So I will definitely recommend that as a contact
point. That's brilliant. We'll do that at the end of today's podcast. Right, okay. Now we'll also then move on to another book by Brian Bonnard, Island Dread. Is that right?
It's called Island of Dread in the Channel.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a fascinating book. I've recommended it to quite a few people that want to know a bit more of what went on in Alderney, so far as the forced workers, all that subject. And they've all said to me, what a fascinating book it is. And yes, Brian Bonnard put the book together, but it's based on letters written by Georgy Kondakov, who was a Russian. He was 16 years old, a Russian guy from Orel, I think you say it, in Russia. And basically when the Germans got through to his town, they just essentially rounded up people that could work for the, for the Germans essentially. And that's how he got roped in. And eventually he ended up in Alderney with actually people he knew from nearby towns and villages. And it describes what he saw, what he experienced, what it was like, what the working for the OT was like, the conditions, and it's in the form of letters that Brian wrote into a book. Basically, Brian let him write it, and he just stitched it together with some photographs, and Georgie sent him a couple of photographs. Now, one thing Georgie wanted to do, ever since he went back to Russia, which he did after the war, he survived, obviously, was go back to Alderney, because he thought Alderney was probably a beautiful island, but he saw a different side of it, obviously, at that time. And he was invited by the States of Alderney in the early 80s, well, I think once Brian had got this book up and running, as a guest to come for a meal. He'll be shown around the island, he'll be treated as a dignitary. And he did. He came with, I'm not sure if it was his daughter or with an interpreter, but he came over. Brian met him at the airport. Brian spent a lot of time going to places in Alderney with him. And Brian said to me, I asked Brian Barnard once, I said, I understand that Georgie remembered everything. He remembered every nut and bolt of he had an incredible memory. And Brian said, yes. He said, I couldn't believe that he could remember something or a building, something happened in exactly. And he actually took me to this building. He remembered where it was, so this was 40 years after. So he would have been, not far off 60, and he had a memory as sharp as a razor. And Brian said, I had no doubt that everything he told me, he was a real gentleman, really nice guy. Everything he told me, I had no doubt was 100% true. And he took a lot of satisfaction of going back to Alderney in modern day times, as it were, back in the 80s, and treated like he should have been treated, just normally and with respect. And he said, what a beautiful island, but it's just such a shame that I saw a different side of it. But of course, there was no Alderney people there. It was empty. It's a fascinating book. And, it's not a gory book, but there's some stuff in there that, it's not particularly present, but he has to say what he saw.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of controversy raging at the moment about what went on in Alderney. We're sort of holding fire on that, Nick and myself. However, could you just explain, there were 4 camps in Alderney. Did all 4 of the camps have the same function, or were the people there split into different factions, and did the camps have different functions, or were they just essentially the same thing split into four?
Well, they were a little bit different. There was two that were similar and two that were slightly more different. So you had Lager Borkum, Camp Borkum, Lager's camp in German, and they had a capacity of about 500. They could take 500 people. Now, they were German, mostly German workers, skilled technicians, and it wasn't so much of a slave labor camp. They were treated, out of all the camps, they were probably treated, reasonably well. Like the Channel Island workers were treated reasonably well. They had good food rations, etc. The people that went to work on the land in the 1941. They were volunteers from mostly Guernsey and some from Jersey. But the Borkum camp housed these workers, and so they were a skilled worker base. And they weren't slave. That wasn't a slave labor camp. Then you had Norderney camp, which is now the island campsite, and Helgoland camp, which is opposite Platte Saline Bay. And essentially they housed a lot of the forced workers, people that had to work, often with no money. They were supposed to get some wages, but they often get anything at all. They were run by the OT, Organisation Todt, same with Borkum. And they capacities of about 1,500 each. Helgoland was essentially Russian, Ukrainian and Polish workers, but they were called Ostarbeiter, Eastern European workers. So that made up most of Helgoland. They did have other nationalities as well. I think there was something like nearly 30 nationalities in all, but there were 2 Chinese, by the way, in this, 2 Chinese.
Yeah.
So Norderney had quite a share of Russians, but then it had Spanish Republicans went there. Recently, they found figures of probably 500 to 600. I'm just giving you approximate figures. You had Czech force workers, Algerian force workers, Dutch force workers, and you also had a contingent later on in 1943 of nearly 600 French Jews that were considered essentially half Jews because they were married to non-Jewish people. And they ended up in Norderney as well. They had their own section in the camp, in the northern part of the camp. Now, that was an OT camp. Some people say that there was an SS connection there, and there was insofar as that one of the camp commandants, Adam Adler, was an OT employee. He was an OT officer, but he also held a low-rank SS grade rank, Untersturmführer, and sometimes used to put that uniform on. And so people would see him with an SS uniform, and so sometimes say it was an SS camp, but actually, in fact, it was an OT-run camp. Then you had Camp Silt. A lot of people have heard of Silt. That was an OT camp up till March 1943. Then it became an SS camp. It was run by the Totenkopf division from the Guardsborough from Neuengamme camp. So it was a sub-camp of Neuengamme. And that could house up to 1,000 people. And they've been designated more prisoners rather than forced workers. So they were treated not very nicely at all on a whole range of things.
So the SS then, to be clear, I don't believe SS were present on Guernsey or Jersey. Would that be correct?
That's correct. No, they weren't.
So the presence of SS is confined to Alderney. So were they a combat-ready division or regiment? They were simply how?
So they weren't Waffen-SS. They weren't the fighting contingent. They were from the SS Totenkopf division, Death's Head division. Now their division supplied all the guards to the camps, the concentration camps in Germany and other countries outside of Germany in Europe. And there were obviously German people in it. There's also a lot of ethnic Germans and non-Germans that had defected, if you like, to save their own necks. And often they ended up being quite brutal towards their own fellow countrymen. So they were the SS Totenkopf division, and they supplied the guards. And I think when the SS moved to Alderney, I think it was 44 guards and officers, and they bought just under 987, I think, mostly Russian Russian, Ukrainian, Polish prisoners over. Well, they were prisoners, but they were attached to what they call the Construction Brigade 1. Bow Brigade 1. And these Bow Brigades, there was a few of them in Europe, came about to try and clear debris from bombed cities or from bomb buildings, take dead bodies out of buildings, that sort of thing. They were a labour force. And they also had a lot of Germans working for them, political prisoners, even German troops that had fallen foul of the regime in some way. And they were in these construction brigades. And they wore striped pyjamas, like the Jews in
Yes,
Germany. Yeah. And with certain insignia on their pyjamas, like a triangle, upside down triangle could mean a political prisoner and various things like this. So they could be identified of what they were or who they were. And so they came over, nearly 1,000 of them, as a labour force to help with the fortifications. Now, they often got involved with the tunnels. I mean, not very nice work, tunnel digging and back-breaking work, and not being fed and watered as much as the others. So they had a bit of a rough deal, and Silk Camp was made a lot more unpleasant. They put a lot more barbed wire around the place. The SS had actually made it a lot more secure than the other camps when they came over in March 44. And there were, obviously, because of the illness, disease, overwork, exhaustion, various other things. And also there were beatings. Everyone who's read anything about Alderney knows. Yeah, there were people that lost their lives there. And Silk was always known as of all the camps as far the most unpleasant camp. Not that any of them were pleasant at all.
No.
So you had those. I'm giving you a précis again because of the time. But so you had these 4 camps, and now Georgy Kondakov was in Helgoland. Okay, he was one of the Russians, but then he moved to Norderney for a little bit, and he gets back to Russia, and guess what? Stalin throws him in another camp.
Yes.
And he survived, I think, 5 years of harsh labour under Stalin, and back to civilian life afterwards. I mean, this guy is incredible, And the book
yes, that's right. I mean, we before we came on air, we were talking about my family, where my great aunt produced a so-called German baby. But we think, and I've shown you the photograph of the lady, she certainly looks very Russian. And yes. I personally think that she was, her father, whoever he was a Georgian combatant that would have been here. It's just St Martin's area of Guernsey. And of course, I know we're sort of digressing, but we know that the Russian and Georgian and Ukrainian troops were rounded up on the Channel Islands and sent back. A commissar came for them. And many of them didn't make it. They were executed, I believe, in Odessa on arrival. But but George made it. So that's an incredible story. So anybody that was able to pick up, and I said we'll give some details at the end of the podcast, the 2 Brian Bonnard books, Alderney at War and Island of Dread, they would give background to the camps and conditions.
And this is first hand.
Yes,
from
exactly,
Georgie.
Exactly. Yeah.
With a person that had a sharp memory, can remember dates, names, everything.
Yeah. Did it include his time in the Stalin in camps in Russia?
It
does. The Gulag?
It does. It doesn't go into as much detail. The book is taken up mostly with Alderney, but he does mention it towards the end. And the people I reckon it mentioned it to my doctor because he's got an interest in it, and he told me a few weeks after when I went to see him. He said to me, "What a fascinating book." He said, "I'd never heard of it before. It's Island of Dread in the Channel, and it gives a great account from someone that was a reliable witness and at the same time wanted to go back to Alderney and actually see it away from that part of history."
Where did George end his days then? Is it back in Russia?
Yeah, I think he ended his days back in the Orel region of Russia, where his family, well, those that survived, he did have family that survived, and they actually formed a group from people that had survived Alderney and survived going back to Russia because other friends of his got slung in a camp by Stalin's government, and they formed this group, and there's a couple of pictures of them in there. And I mean, the camaraderie between what they'd experienced and what they'd seen, that's probably one of the strongest bonds out. And it's just so good to read it and to understand what happened from without any sensationalist issues.
No, not exactly. Yeah, and it predates the current controversy that's going on at the moment.
Yes.
Okay, so brilliant. We move on. Mm-hmm. We come back to Guernsey. and we are looking at a book by a gentleman called Frank Wilson, who I think was a person that retired here to Guernsey, and Tim will explain, but I think he had a life on the railways, and he wrote Railways in Guernsey about the, I suppose, military railway system here. Mm-hmm. You do a fascinating tour about the railways in Guernsey. Could you explain about the book and why you're recommending it, and what a potential reader is likely to find?
Yeah. Okay, so the Railways in Guernsey by Frank Wilson was, I don't know the exact date, but it was in the 70s, I think he wrote this. But yes, he came over, he had a career at some point in the railways. I have met someone that knew him. He says a really lovely man, really nice gentleman, and because of his connection with railways. And he also had an interest in the occupation. He just put one and one together and came up with this book. It starts off talking about the tram system, which I'm not going to talk about here because that's not why we're here. But there is a section on that before it gets to the German railway section, because there was a railway put in Guernsey by the German forces. Essentially,
to make it plain, there was no rail system here at all, and there hasn't been one since the end of this occupation. I think the tram system is a civilian thing. It's separate. I think the last trams run in 1934, something like that. So we're talking about the German railway being set up from scratch. When were the first tracks laid? 41, 42? Yeah. That's a guess on my part.
No, you're right. Absolutely. 41, mid to late 41, they built a 60 centimetre gauge track. That's 60 centimetres between the two rails, if you like. And that went from a stone yard in St Sampson's in Guernsey, Fallard's Stone Works, which was an active stonework.
Yes, and Sampson's is a northern parish on the island, north of St Peter-Port.
Yeah, it's the second largest town in Guernsey. So they constructed the railway from this stone yard up into a beach, a mile or so away, to Bordeaux, a place called Bordeaux, and the idea was to take pebbles, because they had large pebbles on the beach, back to the stone yard to be crushed so it could be used for two purposes. A, to be mixed into concrete for the bunkers, etc., what have you, and also to be put down for the railway tracks.
Like an aggregate,
yeah, which was all to do with keeping the rails above marshy land, good drainage, etc. And so that was the first one put down, and it was soon after that the main gauge railway, which was 90 centimetres gauge, was put down from St Peter-Port Harbour, actually at the harbour docks, all the way up through St Sampson's, the north part of the island, and then all the way down the west coast. It would cover a lot of where the fortifications were. Of course, they were on the south coast, but that's where the railway got to, a place called Luray on the west coast.
Yes, and this is all at sea level, wasn't it, really? Yes. The railways didn't run up to the parishes, although I think there was a plan eventually to run a service up to St Martin's through St Peter-Port up towards the Jourdberg area, but that never happened. But there's also in the area of Lille, on the common there, the Grand Havre, if people get their maps out, if you still walk along the coastal path and scoff at the path at a certain point, you will pick up cinders that would drop from the locomotives, the fireboxes.
Yeah.
You can, across the road, you can still find the footings of the railway sheds, the repair sheds. And I think the area was known as
Clapham Junction.
Clapham Junction. And photographs of the railway is pretty rare, aren't they? Because it was a sensitive subject.
It was, but I've seen a photograph taken in 42, 43 of the bridge area, a very detailed close-up photograph of some fantastic camera equipment from a Spitfire at 20,000 feet or whatever, and then also of Clapham Junction in its day.
Yeah.
And it's completely different now. It does look like Clapham Junction. It was a railway yard. They serviced the trains there. They had their own canteen. What actually happened is that the 90 centimetre gauge train ran from St Peter-Port to St Sampson's Harbour, if you like, that area. Mm. And then it kind of had a couple of splits. One then continued around and ended up going past Clapham Junction, and the other one went to the north part of St Sampson's Harbour to go through the cement store, wood store, steel yard, so they could collect all that on sidings, and then come back up, put it on the wagons, and then take it eventually down to the bunkers that required it.
Yes, and there were 2 stone crushers that are still in evidence as concrete structures. It's not immediately obvious what they are. There's one just to the north of Pembroke on the coastal path, and there's another one further south, just south of Grand Havre, just off the main road, clearly visible, Levards, near Levards Quarry, near the Stinky Pond, if Guernsey people would know exactly where that is. But also the railway did run right down to the Lorray area, but some of the track was there for barely weeks, and it was taken up almost immediately, wasn't it? It
was, yeah. So they a lot of that was put down in 42, earlier on in 42. It was really hard work. Those rails are heavy. I've actually tried to pick one length up with 3 other big guys, and it's a struggle. So, there's a lot of labour involved with that, and the granite and everything. And they put it down relatively quickly. And once they'd actually got the bunkers in place, again, you had a lot of labour at that time. It was the busiest time of construction, 42 into 43.
Mm.
And as soon as they'd done that part, then they started taking the railway up. Yeah, they took it up as fast as they put it down. But they did leave the east coast section from the harbour up to St Sampson's.
Mm.
But what was I going to say? Yeah, so they used the ballast to put the railways on, and they used cuttings. So there's evidence of cuttings in Guernsey where the railway went through, say, a little hill for essentially a little mound. And there's evidence of granite chipping still left in fields. I know one in particular, near where the actor Oliver Reed used to live in Guernsey.
Yes, I know that part, yeah.
And there's still granite there. When I went to collect some and look in the field, I was speaking to the farmer that was ploughing it, and he said, "Help yourself," he said, "because this has been here since the war, and it gets moved around, but it's a nuisance, really, when it comes to the field." Yeah. So there is evidence left the railway, and on the couple of tours I've done, and I'm going to be doing more in the future, I show people where you can see it. Sometimes you've got to look hard. And during COVID times, I decided to kind of trace everywhere the railway, and I found a few more little bits and pieces, little nuggets. Essentially, a lot of it's gone, though. Stuff is all gone. Yeah. But Frank Wilson's book, you can use it to follow the route. However, there's been a lot of change since the 70s.
And a lot of building over and there's never really too many areas where it's obvious at all, is it? You really got to look hard to find the evidence. The book itself, I have a copy. I've had a copy for some time. It's excellent. How easy is it to obtain?
Well, it's been out of print for a long time. Now, this copy I have here, just in front of me, I got off the internet. I think it was Amazon. It wasn't cheap because it's out of print. You expect to pay a little bit more. I mean, not crazy prices, but a bit more than it would have essentially cost in the shops. But you can still get it. I looked a few weeks ago, and there was a copy on the internet. I think it was on eBay, that one.
Yes, and it's the sort of book that would appeal to people that are interested in the World War, people that are interested in the occupation, and of course people that are interested in trains.
Yes,
it's a pamphlet type book, but well worth getting if it ticks all those boxes for you. Well, Tim, that's fascinating. That we sort of conclude now. Those are your 5 books. I appreciate if I ask you next year, you might have a different 5, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. So. You mentioned the 2 Alderney books and some details in Alderney for those. Could you just explain how to get in touch with the people that might have some? Okay,
there's a shop in Alderney called Shabby Chic, which is SHABBYCHIC, Shabby Chic, and it's run by a lady called Sarah Fisher, and she has got people that send her books. I don't know who her contact is, she's not told me. But she gets all these books in, these I call them golden nuggets, they're out of print, on Channel Island occupation, and a lot of them in Alderney. For example, I've seen on the Channel, I think last week I was there, and there were 2 copies of that. Railways in Guernsey she's had, Alderney at War, she's got one of those or had those, so she can get these books. So that is another avenue to explore if you want to have a look. But you have to expect to pay a couple more pounds for them.
Yes, of course, print, of course. Well, if people want to try and trace these books and can't find them themselves, if they want to get hold of myself and Nick at occupied@gnetradio.com, we can talk to Tim and we can make some inquiries on your behalf, and I'm sure we can track books down or put you. We wouldn't be offering a book finding service per se in the fact that we would mail them to you, but we might be able to put you in contact with people that are able to sell them to you. Look, Tim, absolutely fascinating. We're sort of running out of time now.
Okay.
Thanks ever so much to come in and talk about these books. Fascinating subject they cover.
Thank you.
So thank you. Just like to say thank you very much. We will be having Steve Foote from Blue Ormer Publishing in shortly to talk about books that he's published. Seem to mainly concentrate on diaries, etc. But again, fascinating. We're going to play out again with Jim and 5 to 7. Thank you for listening. Any queries, please, or questions, please, like many of you do, get in touch with us at occupied@gnetradio.com. So my thanks again to Tim. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
And we'll probably tweet some pictures of the books out shortly. Okay, thank you. And here's Jim to see us out. Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone. Left on a ship 'cause they knew what was to come. But someone had to stay to carry on.